Apocalypse. Almost every religion or culture on Earth have a doomsday prophecy, as if humanity is collectively afraid of something that will completely ruin our legacy and our civilization. There is something strangely luring in this idea, some dark pull, if you will, the end of things. A comet drops from the sky and smites the Earth, ending life as we know. But that doesn't need to be the case. World-ending scenarios can be subtle and spread in time, starting with a small conflict and turning into a war, a total war and annihilation, followed by natural calamities. Things don't need to end so suddenly, and they don't need to end completely. Because apocalypse is just a violent end of the current order. There is always a new order on the horizon. Doomsday scenarios are vastly overused in media, but especially in superhero movies, because you always know that the world-ending threat will be averted by our hero by the end of the day. Sure, the stakes are high, but no one really believes anymore that the world will actually end, because this trope is just extremely exhausted. But what if it does? What if the world truly ends? Before we start, I want to make clear that we will not be touching post-apocalypse in this video, at least not post-apocalypse at its classical form, the Mad Max / Fallout style apocalypse. I prefer to touch upon the roughly unexplored and not that popular mechanic of storytelling, which is world ending, the inevitable end of the world. So why set your stories in a world-ending scenario? Because the true nature of people reveal themselves in the times of life-threatening calamities. Everyday people become heroes. Those that we thought that are strong and tough suddenly break down. The true nature of your personality takes priority and face with survival. And those who are living meaningless lives, they suddenly have an opportunity to redeem themselves. You can explore highly divided factions and highly divided groups of people who try to find common ground and trying to unite against this calamity that's trying to destroy their way of life and put aside their petty squabbles. Actually, Game of Thrones was pretty good at setting it up in the beginning of the show with the hordes of the undead slowly and surely gathering north of the wall and the wildlings trying to escape from them and all of that stuff. And by the end they were trying to put aside all the Game of Thrones, the game of politics, and try to unite Westeros to combat this rising threat that will destroy them all. But then the 8th season happened, and let's not talk about the 8th season. However, what if the world truly ends? Will everything end? As I said in the intro, apocalypse can just lead to a different world order instead of just being the end of everything. Apocalypse as a tool of storytelling is actually a very broad concept. You can do quite a lot with it. Of course, you have your standard natural disaster thing like the movie 2012 or, with the biblical flood. You have also your standard nuclear war. You have the comet hitting Earth and destroying life as we know. But in each of one of those cases, you actually can have the rebirth of civilization, the rise of a different order. But there is a different type of apocalypse, a grim, slow and ever-closing end of the world. The most popular example of that is Dark Souls, and I know Dark Souls is the most overused examples in video essays on YouTube, but it's a very good example, so hear me out. I'm not that big of a fan of the way Dark Souls tells its stories, but the story that it do tell is a very good setting of a very slow and gradual, inevitable death and the end of the world. A dying out of a flame. Because literally the main premise of the game is that the fact that the world is ending, the flame of life is burning out. People are dying just to be reborn, and every single time they do, they lose a bit of their soul and their humanity in the process, which eventually after a dozen and a couple of dozen of deaths, they lose themselves completely and become hollow husks that wander the world of Dark Souls. Everything is falling apart, different parties fight amongst each other for meaningless reason, even though everything is just crumbling down around them. Even you, the main character, you are there just to prolong the age of light, which you will just delay the inevitable end of the world. Or you can extinguish the flame and bring the Age of Darkness, which sounds horrible, but the Age of Darkness is not just nothing and emptiness, it's just a different order. Is it worse? Is it better? It's not really that important from the standpoint of world building and storytelling. It's just a beginning of a different era, a different order, a start of something new, and a new story can be born out of it. But light and dark are not the only things that build Apocalypse. There is also warmth and cold. Meet Frostpunk, a game set in the late 19th century where our world was struck with a new ice age called the Great Frost, a sudden and a very fast approaching ice age that will end the world as we know. Desperate survivors leave for the great heat experimental towers and build settlements around them to resist the freezing cold. But contrary to Dark Souls, Frostpunk have this vibe of survival, of denying your fate, of denying the approaching doom. Yes, the civilization as we know ceased to exist. It's getting colder and colder. We are running out of food, but we need to survive at all costs, and sacrifices needed to be made. Should we employ child labor to increase our mining of coal so that we can survive a bit longer with the freezing cold outside? Should we start cannibalism to save some food? Should we let people from the further part of the town freeze to death so we can cool down the generator and spread a bit less heat so we can survive a bit longer and save more coal? There are hard choices and sacrifices to be made, but all of that is in the spirit of surviving at all costs. There is even a soundtrack in this game called The City Must Survive, and the soundtrack is extremely dramatic, but at the same time very hopeful and defiant. And if you are getting through some harsh time in your life, I really recommend listening to this music. You'll feel like fighting back. And contrary to Dark Souls' black-pilling, depressing end of the world, Frostpunk have a theme of fighting to the bitter end. And those are just two of many different types of world-ending cataclysm that you can employ in your world and in your stories. You can use world-ending scenarios not only to give your stories more drama and more urgency, but you can also use them as another chapter that will change everything in your universe. When creating stories in your universes, you can take the world-ending scenario and use it as a transitionary chapter to your story. Maybe you exhausted your world and you just want to write a different story, but in the same time you don't want to make another world and create another world-building setting to forge everything. You can then set up a doomsday event which actually happens and destroy how the world actually looked like and how it actually functioned, and make a new world that you want to write your stories in that arose from the ashes of that apocalypse. Of course, you need to be very careful to not do it out of spite of your own world if you are tired of it, because you can make a very big mistake by pissing off your fan base, just like Warhammer did with its End Times, which had a pretty good premise, but absolutely horrible execution. The last thing that you also need to remember is scale. I know I keep talking about world ending, but the world doesn't need to be taken literally in this case. The world part of world ending can be taken as contextual and individual. You can have a calamity that destroys a continent in your fantasy world, and the remnants of people who lived in this continent now move to a different continent, which creates new conflict, and new conflict gives you new ideas and new setup for stories. There are also places and universes where world ending is not really a big deal. Take Warhammer 40k for example. World ending, or more simply planet ending in Warhammer 40k is just another Tuesday. The Imperium of Man have millions of worlds, and losing just one planet, one world is nothing, is meaningless in the scale of things. Apocalyptic scenarios in such universes need to be scaled up a lot to a galaxy level to mean anything, and Warhammer 40k actually did that with the Cicatrix Maledictum in the 8th edition. Remember that whenever you do your Doomsday, your Apocalypse, to scale it correctly to fit your world and your narrative. The subject of decaying world is largely unexplored, and I personally much prefer it to the worn out post-apocalypse scenario. Although now when I think about it, the post-apocalypse scenario is not as bad and it doesn't suffer as much as a zombie apocalypse in terms of exhaustion of content. I hope you find this video very useful, because I actually really wanted to make a video in this very specific subject because it's largely unexplored, and this is a very interesting setting for storytelling and world building. There is plenty more to explore in this genre, and I will surely come back to it at some point with some new insight at one point. But that will be all for now. Please like, comment, subscribe, and everything else to appease the gods of algorithm. And remember that you are just one page, one chapter away from greatness.